Thank you everyone for joining this very important session on systems that drive silence and the front line on domestic and family violence and sexual violence. Would like to acknowledge that where we're dialing in from, we are on the lands of the Gadigal people, or always was and always will be lands of the Gadigal people, and pay our respects to elders past and present. And wherever we are, we also are on unceded sovereign lands. We have three incredible speakers today ready to share their knowledge and insights and lived experience with us. And I've got to be really transparent from the get-go. I'm so excited to host this session because before this role, most of my working and life has been in the domestic and family violence space. So this is a really close topic to home, and to be able to unpack this today with, people that are working that front line and involved in space and involved in other ways of providing supports is really, really special. And I think this is a really timely discussion to have those nuanced conversations around what a good first response looks like. So we'll introduce our speakers. And first of all, we've got Lauren, or Loz Caulfield, and they are the coordinator of the Naarm-based Beyond Survival project, which works at the intersection of family violence and violence of policing. Beyond Survival provides legal assistance and other support to people experiencing family violence who are criminalised or harmed by police, and undertakes research and advocacy. Thank you for joining, Loz. We also have Tyne McConnon, and Tyne is the Principal Family and Child Safety Lawyer for the Tasmanian Aboriginal Legal Service, as well as its specialist service, SIS. Tyne was involved in the establishment of SIS, which saw the first family violence prevention legal service be established in Tasmania for Aboriginal victim survivors of family and or sexual violence. Tyne currently works across her island home of Lutruwita. Apologies, Tyne. Lutruwita.
No, that's okay.
Thank you. And however, has worked across in her career in regions such as the Kimberley, Pilbara regions of Western Australia. Thank you, Tyne. And we have Arlia as well joining us, who is the CEO of the Central Tablelands and Blue Mountains Community Legal Centre and lives on unceded Wiradjuri country in Bathurst. Arlia has worked in the community legal sector for 20 years, mostly working with Aboriginal women who have experienced family violence and or sexual assault. Arlia has worked at the Women's Legal Services in New South Wales and in Western Australia as well. And she is passionate about social justice, human rights and community legal education. So at the very least, today's conversation is covering many, many regions and many jurisdictions across the country. But to start off with, I did want to, bear with me, really highlight and kind of set the scene of why we're having this conversation today. And I will throw it over to you first, Loz. But what I really wanted to address is that domestic and family violence is a national concern, as it very much should be. But so far we've had mostly a strong emphasis in policy around police-led responses and actions. Now we are starting to see a bit of a tipping point, I think, of government records and documents starting to acknowledge that these policies are not having the intended impact. This may not be new to some, and it's definitely not new to a lot of people. It is becoming new into the policy and recorded arena. So what do we notice? So I guess I'm going to open it up to everyone after Loz of what are you noticing in your work in this space around this push to always have a police first or law enforcement response? And in kind of capturing that, Loz, I know you've recently released a report that absolutely touches on this and the harmful impacts of policing. So I'd love to hear from you around what are you noticing in your work and starting off with the recent launch of that report. Oh no, Loz, we haven't got a... It's not an online conference without a...
I'm going to swap tech and see if that works.
Beautiful. There we go. We're on.
You got me now? Great. Thanks so much. I wanted to just before I speak, firstly apologise for anything nonsensical that I say. I'm dialing in, I'm in Brighton in England, sort of in the belly of Empire, one of the bellies of Empire, and so it's pre-dawn here. Hopefully I'll still make some sense, but it means I'm chiming in a little bit later than I'd hoped to for the symposium. Thanks so much, Chloe. I mean, it's, as you said, like it's a huge question, isn't it? In some ways it's a bit of a juggernaut of this kind of law and order agenda that rolls through all sectors, all types of politics, and what that has looked like in the family violence space that I work in. It's really looked like a dogged commitment to defaulting to policing as a site of safety, even in the face of evidence that shows that that is very often not the case for survivors who are actually harmed in the course of family violence policing. And so I work in a small project we're called Beyond Survival. Our inception occurred in the context of the Royal Commission into Family Violence, and part of, so it was born out of the Police Accountability Project. And one of the reasons that we established the project is that we closely tracked the research that was being done through the Royal Commission, the comprehensive evidence that was gathered from survivors, from frontline services, and this evidence that really detailed a body of harm that was occurring to people experiencing violence as a consequence of family violence policing. But then what we saw in policy and in practice was still a set of recommendations that centred and entrenched the role of police in family violence, centred them as first responders, made them crucial and core to the family violence service system, without any corresponding recommendations for either alternative pathways or for victim survivors or people experiencing violence who were actually being harmed in the course of that policing. And so we established a really small project. We piloted it. We've been running since that time. And what we've noted in practice is, mirrored in what we had seen in the evidence that went into the Royal Commission, is that there are these patterned and layered harms that flow from family violence policing, and that rather than representing safety for survivors, actually entrench and double down on and extend the risk and the harm of family violence. I imagine that we'll get to unpack through this session the types of harm that we're talking about, but for us, we very quickly saw some key themes in those harms, and we have sort of adjusted and mirrored our priority intake criteria around those types of harms. And so for us, they include things like racialised violence, so racial profiling enacted through family violence policing, and we tie this very closely with what's often described as misidentification. So this idea that it's a practice mistake by police who are erroneously identifying victim survivors of family violence, overwhelmingly Aboriginal women and women of colour, as the perpetrators of that violence. We don't see it as a mistake. We see it as an intentional and pattern practice that is, absolutely racial profiling by another name. So that's a core area of harm that we see. And of course, it has cascading consequences. There's a continuum of harm that flows from that original misidentification or incorrect identification by police. We also work on police-perpetrated family violence. We do this for a number of reasons, because it's an acute nexus of harm, because it is something that also very much speaks to the kind of cultures of impunity that pervade policing. So we work on it both because of the individual harm, the levels of risk to people experiencing that violence, but also because of what it reveals when we actually start looking at the ways that police-perpetrated family violence occurs, the tactics involved, what happens when survivors of that violence report to police, and what this actually demonstrates about police as an institution in terms of the ways that police actually embody many of the drivers of family violence, those documented drivers that so many of us grapple with in our practice, the ways that they actually embody and enact these drivers, but nonetheless in a sort of act of extreme cognitive dissonance are still centred in that role. And we also focus on the criminalisation of survivors, so that sort of police to prison pipeline, that means survivors of violence are actually being criminalised and, right through to being incarcerated as a consequence of police responses. Chloe, will you gong me if I go on for too long in the answer to this question? But in terms of the research, because it was a bit of a two-part question, We and I think my amazing co-author, Dr. Peter, might be on this breakout room, so shout out if she's on here. She could much more capably speak to a lot of the statistical work done on this research. But it's a real challenge. There is a lot of practice-based anecdotal evidence that is held. There is lived experience evidence, there is anecdotal evidence held by frontline workers and by services, and yet we find ourselves in this narrative battle seeking to build an evidence base that actually speaks to and demonstrates the level of harm, the prevalence and the breadth of the harm that is flowing out of police responses to family violence. And it's been a challenge to document that harm, and that challenge occurs for a number of reasons. One, it's incredibly political work. It's very difficult to get data out of police, the institutions around the continent. There are also all kinds of challenges for services in sharing information in terms of confidentiality, but also the capacity question, the amount of crisis response that services are actually doing, and then the challenge of kind of pulling back from that crisis work to then share information and to start mapping the harm. And so we had spoken with numerous other services, many of them in this room, Rouge and others from Women's Legal, about how we start to map and document this harm. And so one of the ideas that we followed up was, well, how do we gather practitioner evidence? Because if we're speaking with practitioners, each frontline worker is themselves often supporting people experiencing violence and dealing with and observing police, through multiple matters, on each day of practice. And so what that offers us is a really unique insight, an expert practitioner based, frontline evidence base of what policing actually looks like in practice. So not what's in policy documents or in press releases, but what it looks like on the ground, and also what happens when practitioners push back and seek, any notion of accountability from police. So we put out a survey to frontline practitioners. We hoped to get about 100 responses in a 3-month period. I think we hit 270 responses so quickly that we ended up closing the survey because of the challenge of kind of going through that data. It's the largest sample of practitioner evidence that has been gathered on this issue. And what we found through that research very much mirrored what we are seeing in practice as a smaller project. So while it was a challenge for us to extrapolate out from the kind of smaller number of files that we do, what we now know is that what we are seeing absolutely mirrors what other practitioners are seeing. And the evidence that we gathered there, these are not stories of sort of one-off mistakes of practice. They are details of patterned and pervasive patterns of harm that occur in the course of family violence policing. They're deeply concerning findings. They won't be shocking to many of you. Hi, Peter, now I can see you. And so they include findings that 90% of frontline workers have witnessed police bias and discrimination, including racial targeting. 83% of participants said that they'd witnessed police wrongfully identifying the victim survivor as the perpetrator, so what gets called misidentification. And in terms of police perpetrated violence, more than half of the workers who contributed said they'd encountered situations where the person using violence was a police officer, and many of these had encountered it on more than one occasion. People spoke of upwards of 5 and 10 occasions. So what that tells us is that the very agency that's tasked with responding to family violence has a problem with abusers within its own ranks. And I don't know, Chloe.
I might gong you there.
Yeah, gong me.
only because I think it's a really nice tie-in to, and when you speak about this report and practitioners and really grabbing that sample size, I saw so many head nods, both from Arlia and from Tyne, and I guess I'm really eager to hear from both of you of what are you seeing in your day-to-day work that as frontline workers that policymakers are continuing to ignore and downplay? Because obviously, as what Loz has said, that is this just here, or is it really this replicated issue across jurisdictions? And I saw a lot of head nodding, so I'd love to hear. Maybe I'll hand it over to Tyne first around what are you seeing in your day-to-day that keeps getting underplayed by policymakers?
Yeah, look, to start off with, which I think's a good segue, I do want to pay my respects to the traditional custodians here of the Palawa Nation. And I think it's a good segue because in that, the past, the present, and all that emerging knowledge and strength is what we rely on every day. And culture is strong. And that's something that I'm really passionate about. Family violence is not a part of Aboriginal culture. It's not just an issue for Aboriginal communities. And that's something that I find myself continually advocating for and trying to not just educate but speak to people about, that strength in culture, in community, is something that I feel a lot of policymakers, those in government, struggle to understand. The other issue I have a lot of the time, and it seems that it wants to be ignored or it isn't listened to, is numbers. Statistics aren't everything. We know that from the numbers when we're speaking here today. Estimates show that around 90% of family violence against First Nations women is undisclosed. That's some of the research that we're seeing now, and that the numbers don't tell the story that we're looking at, or what our women and children are going through as well, or are healing from. And on the flip side of that, though, is in services like ours, it's when we're always asked to provide numbers for our funding, to be able to say, this is how many cases we've got, this is what success looks like. That success isn't in numbers. It's impossible to put that into statistics, into their grant reviews and applications. How do you explain to someone that success looks different to everyone, and what is success? And how working with one person, that's not just an effect on that one person or on that family. That's generations to come. And that will have generational impacts. So something that I'm trying to continually look at is looking at the stories and hearing from community, hearing from people, because this type of work can't be put into those types of numbers. And it seems that that's really difficult for people to understand. And as I said, it works in both ways when we look at that, as in when our services are trying to say or give stories of what we're doing. And it also works on the flip side, that what's the real picture here? We also know that closing the gap, the figures that are coming out there and updating figures aren't a true story. I don't think I need to argue with anyone here. How accurate actually are they? And probably the third thing is that when we're looking at our justice system, when we're looking at police response, or when we're looking at this issue, I see a lot of my clients, victims, survivors, they get lost in this system. It's not about them. And we see a risk matrix can actually increase when they're going through that justice system as well. But it's not victim or survivor led. And when I'm speaking to my clients, when I'm speaking to them around what they want to see, it isn't often a punitive thing that they want to be seeing. That's not the outcome they're wishing for. It's around healing, and it's around changing behaviour. So that's some of the things that I would like to get through, I guess, to be able to speak really honestly with policymakers, with government, and be able to look at that, because there's so much more to the story than we're able to tell a lot of the time, or that people are able to listen to, I guess.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I guess I'll throw it to you, Arlia, in terms of in your day-to-day, I guess, what are you seeing that often gets unheard or missed by policymakers?
Yeah, I think, all the things that Loz was talking about, we see a lot of misidentification in our communities as well. And, I think the points that Tyne was making, that there is this continual lack of listening. So we're hearing a lot about truth telling in the previous session, but people are now starting to talk about there needs to be some truth listening, right? And there's been so many reports, there's been so many inquiries, and there are people crying out for different approaches, and that's just not being listened to. And I think what is always really, really frustrating to me, and we're seeing this kind of around the country at the moment with changes to bail laws, and it's this kind of idea of quick wins for governments, where they just kind of bend to the populist kind of law and order agenda where they think it's going to get them some votes. And when we're talking about family domestic violence and sexual assault, it's obviously, it's complex. And so it is hard for people to really, and these are big conversations, that we're having today. But I really also just get really frustrated with, Loz mentioned cognitive dissonance, and we have in the legal system a complete cognitive dissonance going on. So we see on the one hand, when there's been family violence or sexual assault, women are told they just have to leave the relationship, and we pretend that that's going to create safety for people. And, again, it's this kind of simple solution that's presented to people. And then if you share children, for instance, with someone who's perpetrated harm, in the family law system, you're told, well, you have to mediate with that person and you have to facilitate contact with that person. Yet there is absolutely no opportunity across any of that for some real accountability and real healing for people.
And I think I'll pick up something you said in there, because I think when I've had these conversations with people before, a bit of a missing a conversation, or I guess really trying to picture in people's psyche of like, what does creating safety look like? And I think there's been such a big narrative of terms of, you call this X rocks up, saves the day, la la la. But maybe I'll work backwards. So starting with you, Arlia, I guess in your day-to-day work, what does creating safety look like, and how are you supporting victim survivors in that work? And I think it'll be just a bit of a descriptor to really help people understand of what does creating that safety look like.
Yeah, thanks, Chloe. I was really heartened to hear a lot of messages this morning around, listening, seeing, believing, and that care and that dignity, and that is what can lead to real healing for people, right? And so we very much adopt an approach of doing that, of really listening to people, meeting them where they're at, not adopting this paternalistic approach that is this top-down approach that we see from governments and police. So really listening to people about what they need, and really being guided by what people tell us will help them achieve safety. And we often see women with AVOs in place where the conditions are not appropriate, and they might want to vary the conditions of the AVO, and we might assist with that. We do lots of practical, obviously, support and advocacy to make sure people have, safe housing, have security, have, a mobile phone that is safe for them to use, linking them in with other support services around. So really trying to work as collaboratively as possible in our local communities. But, it is hard. We're really constrained. We're constrained not only by funding, of course, as Tyne touched on, and all those kind of things that we have to do to maintain that funding, but we're constrained by the lack of options, as I said, for real accountability, for real healing. And I think, there's this reliance that we, inevitably have on these harmful systems. And people we're not able to offer other things to people to really create some sense of accountability and healing. It's just it's really disappointing, I think, for a lot of clients, where you can see that that's actually what they need and it's what they want.
Thank you, Arlia. I'll working backwards throw that question to you, Tyne.
Creating safety, I think it's such a complex question, or a complex sort of meaning, because safety looks different to everyone, and we're working in systems, under legislation that is unsafe in so many different ways, and also in courts. So it's a really difficult thing to answer, and I don't think there's one answer that you can provide to that, because as was just said, it's different in every matter, listening obviously to your clients. But when we're looking at safety within systems which are made to be unsafe, that's a really difficult thing. Through my work, I do a lot of work in that community engagement space, but I am always meeting with the community. But I recognise that every community, even in Tasmania, is different. And that answer means something very different to everyone. For me, speaking to my clients and working with them, but being honest about the systems that we're working in, I find is a really important thing, providing my clients and the people I work with that knowledge. So they're aware of what these systems are, and they have the knowledge to be able to make their own decisions, because it is their matters that I'm representing them with, and they're the experts in that area. So yes, we do a lot of collaboration. We do a lot of listening, but I think it means something different to everyone, to every person, to every family, to every community. And I guess it touches on the last question as well, when we're looking, and you'd like policy, makers or governments to realise something. Every family, every community is different, and they have different needs. And every service and every worker upon here needs to be able to be flexible, which is something that we don't see in our funding either. You're provided with funding and you're like, you will do this. This is what this community needs. Like every other community in Australia, this is what they need, this type of worker. And it's really difficult to get any flexibility in that. So I do find in my role, we are a funded family violence prevention legal service, but that role can mean very different things.
Thank you. And over to you, Loz, which I think I might need to unmute. Yeah. There you go.
Sorry about that. I was instructed not to mute, but I did mute. Well, everything that Arlia and Tyne have both said, I think rings absolutely true for practice here. In terms of the Beyond Survival work, everybody that we support's been harmed in the course of family violence policing. It's how they find their way to us. And so what that means for us is that we approach family violence risk assessment in a way that means it's embedded with coexisting risk assessment. So we wouldn't assume that police are a site of safety or will represent increased safety if they're involved. Often we're working with people to assess coexisting risks. So it might mean that we're using the Naarm framework, that looks at the risk of serious injury or lethality in family violence, but we're also looking at coexisting risks, child removal, immigration status, some of these, like the risk of criminalisation if police are involved. So for us, that looks like actually really overhauling even the templates that we use for risk assessment and safety planning. It means when we're scaffolding safety, we're absolutely not using a model that defaults to 000 or police responses. I will say, back to, I think Tyne's mentioned so astutely the funding challenges and the pressure on services often to work within those systems. We work with a model we're wholly philanthropically funded. That presents all kinds of funding challenges, but what it does mean is that we often work in very creative practice. We believe it's rigorous, we absolutely use the evidence-based frameworks, but we are working also in I think both of you mentioned, a survivor-led way. We know over generations of both lived experience, community experience, and evidence-based research that the most reliable predictors of risk is the assessment of the person experiencing violence, and the most reliable way to guide safety is the assessment of the person experiencing the violence. So it's it's the place that we need to start. What makes people safer is what people tell us will make them safer, and so that's the principles that we're sort of using to guide that work. And I guess the only other thing to say in that space is that I think Arlia mentioned also the ways that the systems themselves are so harmful, and so what we endeavour to do is to work in what gets called in a funding model a socio-legal model, which means we're providing legal assistance, but we see it as wraparound work. We talk about it as walking alongside work from the position of harm minimisation. So rather than talking about those processes, whether it might be intervention order processes, family law processes, as delivering justice, we actually consider the risks of those processes, and we try and adopt a harm minimisation approach to walking alongside people through those processes, and then working creatively to try to generate options outside of some of those systems approaches. So that might be narrative storytelling, it might be collective advocacy, it might be all types of things, but a commitment to doing both of those types of bodies of work with people.
Absolutely. And I think from what's really shined through everyone's answers is like these roles or these frontline workers end up almost being a bit of a buffer. It's sort of a weird role to have, where it's sort of having to interplay with this system that's being funded and seen as the right way, and then equally there's all these other services that are then kind of more acting like a buffer as opposed to a direct link to said service, and obviously always led by the person experiencing harm. And I did want to go back, glad you're just finished with you, Loz, it's to systemic discrimination and racism shaping people's experiences. And I know everyone has touched on this in their work and would have seen it in their work. But this is one of the key themes that have come out by having a police very much are seen as the only first response in this space. And if you can just speak to a little bit about what came through in the report when it came to systemic racism and over-policing of certain groups of people experiencing violence.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. It's a beautiful and core question. I know Arlia and Tyne, you'll have, so much to say on this. But I think, from here, there's a core question is this kind of, even the framing of the ways that systemic discrimination and racism is spoken about. Often the question is asked as if it's, does systemic discrimination and racism shape people's experiences, and what are the barriers? And for us, what we'd want to do is flip that question, and to say, yes, systemic racism and discrimination drives and shapes the violence that people are subjected to. That is the case across the board. It is absolutely the case in the context of policing. We need to look to the history of policing on this continent, the role of police in the perpetuation of the colony, the ongoing colonial project. And so I think often what can happen in the family violence sector is a slippage in language that is really significant in terms of then how we grapple with both interpersonal and systemic violence. So, the idea that there might be barriers, that if people get over them, then they can assume a helpful or a benign response, at least from systems, rather than understanding that the systems are functioning exactly as they were intended. It's no mistake, that particular people are being targeted by police and picked up in those responses. So yeah, we would say absolutely what we're looking at is including in practices such as so-called misidentification, that's the practical embodiment, the lived experience of racial discrimination as it runs through policing and as it's enacted on victim survivors.
Thank you. And I'll throw it over to Tyne in terms of,
Yes.
The head nods are all coming through, so I'm sure there's lots to say.
Well, it definitely shapes people's experiences. We see it here. I see it in my work daily. A lot of my clients can't put it into words. It's hard to answer, like, what does that look like? Or how does that affect someone? Because we can see it. It can be in body language. It can be in spoken language. It can be in the way that you're left sitting there before you get to be able to speak to a police officer, or if you're told to come back, or how urgently your complaint's dealt with, or even possibly how quick the police come and their attitude. So it's a really difficult thing to answer when people ask, what does it look like? Because so much of it is unable to be put in exact words or behaviours. But what we see it doing is that people are less likely to report, are less likely to see those people as safe. And we've got a system, as we've heard today, which is police reliant as that first responder. There is no other option. In Tasmania, we don't have any other justice systems or community or cultural led answers. So that is the only response that people have. So what we do see when people are feeling this way is they're less likely obviously to report, but we also have families as well, and children and other people that are watching this. So it can spread like that as well. But what we also see here is that people are less likely to report at times because of fear of child safety, which is a well-known fact. So it's a hard thing. I see it in a lot of my matters, but it's hard to give an exact example because a lot of the time it's the way that people feel, and at the worst times it's when they are charged or misidentified, and then they need to go through that system and prove their innocence after everything that's occurred to them and need to go into that courtroom. Also in Tasmania, we don't have a specific family violence list. We don't have a child safety list or a court or a specific magistrate that deals with child safety or family violence matters. So we're also seeing at that end that people are put into that main court system, which is completely safe, is completely unsafe, I should say, as well. So yes, we see it all the time. But again, it depends on every family and community as to those barriers, what they look like, and how they're felt.
Thank you. And Arlia, if you had any...
Yeah, look, I really liked the way that Loz framed that, and I think it's really important for everybody to not forget that we have a country that was founded on a racist belief, and at a time, and our legal system is founded on a system that treated, and in fact, was law that women and children were property. And the Aboriginal people were not counted as people until the referendum in 1967. So when we're talking about systemic discrimination, we need to really keep that in mind. We still see that those things are playing out today. There's an enormous amount of victim blaming. There's an enormous amount of women who rock up at police stations or call the police, are turned away, are told horrendous things, are given incorrect advice about the law from the people that are supposed to be enforcing the law, which is always incredibly difficult for people to understand. But yeah, I just think it's really important that we keep in mind the history of this country.
And I think while we're on this topic, because I might start leading into some of the questions coming through as well, but someone has asked around, how do we prevent replicating systems of harm or responses of harm of a colonial system in recreating a response that serves the needs of victim survivors? There may be already, some things that I've touched on this, but I guess what would you see as like your key must-haves in an alternative sort of response system? And maybe I'll throw it back to you, Tyne, around what would be some key things to not replicate what we have now.
Well, I think it's down to respect. We've got hundreds of thousands of years of knowledge here, of culture and community, of strength. We've got elders. We've got people that we can speak to. Healing practices. As I said earlier on, family violence isn't a part of Aboriginal culture. We've got all of this here, but for some reason it doesn't seem that knowledge, and we are so lucky that a lot of our elders are able to provide that, and very giving in speaking to us about that at our service. But it comes down to that respect, because it's just ignored. That's almost like it's not respected in these sort of systems. So when we're looking at how do we change this system, we've got a lot of knowledge here in Australia. We need to listen. We need to ask. And we need to also, when we're talking about family violence, and we've spoken about this today, listen to the victim survivor. Make it survivor-centric, whereas we've got a system which is driven by prosecution and the victim survivors are witness. And I have seen it where witnesses have been, or victim survivors, have been given a warrant to attend court when they do not want to. So that whole system is, it's not working. We can see that at the moment, it's not working. We're looking at our closing the gap targets, target 13. We're failing. So we need to change something. That would be some of the first things that I think we need to look at. It's restorative justice, it's at healing, and it's looking at the systems which victims and survivors as well are able to drive.
Thank you so much. And I think, like you said, and it's sort of been the theme of a lot of today, it's like the answers are here. It's like picking up those answers, or at the very least letting those ways of being and doing flourish. Loz, some thoughts around not replicating and what is needed to have a true alternative first response, and what would you say are key must-haves?
I deeply agree with what you've just said, Tyne, about some of those fundamental positions and values. I think maybe I might answer it from a kind of, a movement-based or an advocacy-based perspective, which is that I think very often we are, one of the greatest successes of the colonial project is the capture of imagination, the ways that we end up responding from a place that defaults to these these myths about safety, these myths that police represent safety, that they're functioning even in the way that they're described to us. And so I would say, well, one of those principles is the recapturing, of our imagination, the creativity, the community knowledge, Tyne, that you've just spoken about, that exists here, but also stripping it to kind of some of those fundamental questions of ourselves in what we advocate for. So what would it take for us to resist the invitation and the pressure to call for thin reforms, training, these types of reforms that we know don't work and that will entrench the same systems? And so I think for me and for us, it comes down to these kind of fundamental questions at both the individual level, working with individual people, and the systemic level. So questions like, will this action, will this advocacy or this reform extend resources and power, to the state and to policing as an institution, or will it extend resources and power, to the person experiencing violence or to the community at the wider level? Whose narrative, whose truth is it actually endorsing? Is it a state power over narrative, or is it the truth telling of the person experiencing violence? And so I think for us, we'd want to come back to these just really core positions of only advocating for and endorsing options that refuse carceral narratives, that centre both resources and power with individuals and with communities, with survivors in survivor-led responses, and to build out from there. And I know we'll probably move into talking about some of those models through the session.
Thank you. And I do have a comment here about learning from the oldest living culture. And I think in this context, we actually have that gift. We have that opportunity to learn from the oldest living culture as well. Arlia, I might chuck a similar but slightly different question that has come through. And I do think this is a question that often comes up, and I'm so glad we get to answer this and really unpack it. But someone's put through is, do you think an alternative first responder model, with what the keynote spoke about this morning? I'm sure, Loz, you very much should have been asleep. I'm glad you probably, I don't think you would have seen that session, but sort of an alternative civilian dispatch, or, some sort of different response where people can be taken to an alternate location, an alternative to police and minimising police's role in that work. Would it work in situations where there is an acute risk of violence to victim survivors and or responders? And I guess really what we're unpacking here is that acute risk and when and how and what that looks like. And so as all of you here who work with people who have been in those acute risk situations, what are your thoughts? And I guess, do you think that would work?
Look, I think it can work, and I think actually it does work already. I think there are plenty of people who don't necessarily resort to calling 000 in cases of family violence. They might call a family member, they might call a friend for support, and they're using their own skills to de-escalate the situation, to remove the person that's caused harm from that place, and create that bit of breathing space, perhaps. So I think that there is definitely, and I was really listening with a lot of interest to Alexander this morning, because he did kind of talk about the a lot of those projects there as not involving responding to violence. But what I can see is that there is potential, and as Loz was talking about, we really do need to be reimagining different ways of dealing with these kind of societal issues that are health issues, that are economic issues, human rights issues, without relying on police. And we hear that from women that we work with. That's not what people are wanting. People want the violence to stop. They don't necessarily want someone taken away from community and incarcerated, because again, that doesn't promote accountability and it doesn't promote any healing for people. And I was really, and I wrote down in my notes, I can really see, and Tyne mentioned it, and there's lots of calls at the moment around restorative justice or transformative justice, and some examples of that happening around the country for victim survivors of family violence and sexual assault. But that kind of happening in that response destination that Alexander was talking about this morning. So whatever that first response might be, there needs to be something else to really, to address the harm that has been caused.
Thank you, absolutely. Maybe a good pass over to you, Tyne.
Yes, I apologise. I was with a client this morning, so I wasn't able to watch that session. I apologise. But I did see in the questions in here around alternatives to mandated reporting in domestic violence situations involving children. And look, I guess my issue with this is that the way that information's used. So some of my clients have been, they've called police and they have reached out, but the way in which that is flipped, that they are the risk and that they are a risk to their children. So that's something that I have a big issue with, how that information is used and how it's documented. And that comes down to our first responders as well, and the way in which that information is collected and the way the situation is viewed. So when we're looking at that, I think when there are these situations and we do have, our women that are asking for help, calling out for help, that's not to be used as a risk issue. That is it shouldn't be just a mandated child safety are going to come and check up on you to make sure you're okay. That's almost an avenue for, okay, things aren't good. How do we help you? How do we help your kids? And let's look at this so we can ensure that you're safe and healing. So I guess when I'm looking at that and the whole system in which is set up, which we've spoken about today, it's almost all the wrong way around, the way things are used, the way things are viewed. And when people are calling, as I've said a few times today, what's the outcome that they want if they are calling police for that? And I think we have to continue to listen to that.
Absolutely. Over to you, Loz.
Thanks so much. They're excellent responses. I have so many thoughts. I missed the session, but I'm a big fan of the work of the Policing Project. So, yes, we do think that absolutely models like that need to be invested in. There's a couple of things I wanted to say, even in response to the kind of wording of the question. It speaks volumes because we are often very reticent to talk about alternative first responder models when it comes to gender-based violence and family violence. And inherent in that reticence is this idea that police are effectively addressing risk or improving safety, which is something that we need to really fundamentally challenge. And it's so relevant for us in our consideration of alternative models, because it's also really relevant to thinking about what we are measuring against. There can be this tendency for us to measure against this sort of utopian reality or the perfect response, that nails every single aspect of what a survivor needs and where there is zero risk. But actually what we're measuring against is the current reality. And we can see in the research the types of harm that are flowing through policing. So one aspect is, A, what are we measuring against? B, also, yes, as Arlia said, this work is already occurring. We overwhelmingly people experiencing violence are not reporting to police. We know that even when they are reporting, there is a continuum of harm that can range from sort of lethal indifference, no response. I supported someone to report to police a couple of weeks ago, 7 hours later, no police attendance. But very often we know that the first response that is actually occurring to the violence that people are experiencing is the response of the family and friends that they disclose to, and it's often the response of frontline workers or services. So even this idea of who is and who isn't characterised as first responders, I think needs some interrogation. Many of the people in this room have, of course, worked in frontline roles and have very much been part of immediate risk responses, first responses, even though that's not through a kind of a policing model. But yeah, we would absolutely say that those initiatives that divert calls away from police, that formalise an alternative, what we hear from frontline workers and services, we see it in media advocacy as well, is that these arrangements that shackle services into very close relationships with police often limit the work that individual workers can do around working creatively with survivors, and they limit the comments that can be made by services about the harms that they are seeing related to family violence policing. So actually, building out these alternatives and investing in those models is incredibly vital.
Absolutely. And I think And in that, I guess is as part of that question is an unpacking of like, when is this acute risk, and where is that happening, and how is that actually really being responded to? Because I would also, in previous roles that I've had, where that acute risk was occurring wasn't so cookie cutter that it then was just getting responded with this response either. I am conscious we have 4 minutes left, and something, because for whatever reason, gender-based violence does seem to be the one that people go, like, I can agree with this with an alternative, but this one, is a little bit more of a tug and pull. But equally, this work in general, always found also sometimes the most inspiring and most collaborative and, reimaginative work. And that's why I always loved the people that worked in this space. So to end on that kind of note, I just want to ask all of you, what continues to inspire you to work in this day-to-day amongst all this chaotic systems and buffering and listening and deeply being present? And from there, if you had to have an alternative first response, what would it look like? Because it is happening on the work through drop-in centres in Australia and other spaces, but we obviously don't have that complete funded model, as you've recommended in your report, Loz, that we do need to reinvest in a pilot. So maybe I'll keep it with you to answer that question of what continues to inspire you in this work, and can we see an alternative first response being funded?
Well, today was very inspiring, and all of you. And so I would say it's the people who are doing this work every day, and that keep me on track with the commitment, including to bridge the often wild interface that I know so many of us straddle between, paid and organisational work and community-based work. Like it's a movement, not an organisation, and that feels incredibly significant to me, as well as the thinking of loved ones and mentors who sort of rein me in when I'm going off track, but deepen deepen my thinking, and that I learn from all the time. Do I think it's possible? Yeah, absolutely. I don't think we're talking about one alternative. We're talking about many alternatives. It's taken hundreds of years to construct these colonial systems. It's allowed to take, and plenty of mistakes in the building, and so much harm in the building of those systems. It's allowed to take us time to build and reimagine and invest in alternatives, and to, go gently with ourselves, and to reflect together, and to make mistakes, and to learn out loud. But yeah, I absolutely think it's possible. It's already happening, I think, is the answer that we're hearing.
Absolutely. We had the 2-minute warning, so I might...
Sorry.
No. just so we don't get that awkward cut off. Tyne, I'll throw it over to you, and then Arlia will probably have about 45 seconds each.
Okay, what keeps me going? I think it's the strength of the people that I meet with, their stories, their survival, the selflessness, the forgiveness that they're able to continue to do against governments, not just other people and systems which go against them, but also I think the strength, as I mentioned today in my acknowledgement, that strength of, ancestors, the oldest living culture, it's here, it's not going away, and we'll continue to fight for a better way.
Over to you, Arlia.
And just ditto to all of that. And I think there is no other choice but to reimagine a different way, and to keep fighting for that, because we've been trying to reform the system and tinkering around the edges for a really long time, and that hasn't worked, and it hasn't created any safety. So
absolutely. And I think if we all keep, sharing this message. I know someone asked about your report, Loz. I think it's been answered in the comments to definitely give it a read. It's an absolutely, telling report of what's happening on the ground and what needs to be addressed to make things better. I'm going to slightly ramble on until I get cut off, but thank you, everyone, for joining. Tyne, Loz, Arlia. I hope this really evoked some critical thoughts with everyone that's listening in, and give reports a go, give these services a follow, and we'll see you all back in the main session